We are back again, but this time we're switching it up a little bit. We're going to read a paragraph from Michael Gomez's Black Crescent, starting on page 83. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 6.85% of the Africans imported into Saint-Domingue were from Senegambia. Another 4.5% hailed from Sierra Leone, and slightly under 4% were from Mozambique. These zones represent the areas from which Muslims were most likely to come to Saint-Domingue, in declining order of likelihood. It is probable that Muslims also came out of the Gold Coast, which contributed 4.35% of the total for the years cited, and certainly there were Muslims exported from the Bight of Benin, accounting for 27% of the total, although in the latter case the captive-producing holy war of Usman Dan Fodio in what would become northern Nigeria would only begin in 1804. So that it would be several years before the number of Muslims coming from the Bight of Benin would be significant. It is therefore reasonable to assume that Muslims in Saint-Domingue could have been no more than 10% of the enslaved population, and was probably far less. It was Debien's finding that Muslims, Pulard, Hausa, Malay, Manding, and Senegal, were minorities in the 1780s and 1790s, and the Hausa were always male. Not a single Hausa woman is ever identified. Further substantiation of his observations, although crude, can be found elsewhere in his research. Of 14,167 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue between 1796 and 1797, for whom there are proper names, 6,188 are of African origin. 1,651 West Central Africans, Congos, 736 Yoruba, Nagos, 544 Arada, 519 Igbo, 224 Bambara, 124 Hausa, 95 Wolof, Serer, and Fulbe, Senegals, 67 Susu, 26 Fulbe, Pulard, 26 Mandinga, and 2 other Mande speakers, Malays. Beginning with the Hausa, the succeeding groups can be associated with Islam. Assuming all of these individuals were Muslim, the total of 341 persons renders the representation of Muslims in the African-born population at slightly over 5%. For the entire named population of 14,167, the percentage of Muslims drops to 2.4. So our purpose in reading this short passage was to understand exactly how Michael Gomez, in his own careful way, yet still somewhat clumsy, tries to analyze the presence of West African Muslims in Saint-Domingue, or what is today Haiti. We can take issue with the fact that he's assuming, for instance, that Hausa, Wolof, Serer, Fulbe, Susu, and Mandinga can be associated with Islam, especially in the 18th century. Considering the diversity of European sources on that part of Western Africa, particularly the Senegambia, we know that many of, or not most of the Wolof were not Muslim, the Serer were not Muslim. We can be assured that many of perhaps most of the Susu were not Muslim. And we know that there was a discrepancy between the nomadic Fulani and the urban sedentary Fulani when it came to Islamic practice and belief, with several of the nomadic Fulani groups being non-Muslim. Indeed, in some cases, proudly so, according to various European sources on the Senegambia. So we can take issue with the fact that Michael Gomez, I think, is exaggerating or inflating the number of possible Muslims who are in Saint-Domingue. Based on our own research, we would find that perhaps a good chunk of the Manding, a chunk of the Fulbe, perhaps many, if not most of the Hausa, depending on what part of Hausa territories they were from, were probably Muslim. The Malay were probably Muslim, and smaller groups of other Western African Muslims ended up in Saint-Domingue, such as people from Borno or Kanuri people in northern Nigeria, from the ancient Kanem Borno state. So Muslims were definitely there, but I think it's problematic that Gomez seems to be inflating the number of Muslims in Saint-Domingue, estimating that it could have been as high as 10%, although he admits it was probably far less. Honestly, it seems to us that it was probably 5% or less. Just keeping into consideration the mass conversion of Islam in many of these parts of West Africa that Gomez is associating with Islam only dates to the 19th and 20th centuries, it seems problematic to assume that these people would have been mostly Islamic in the 18th century, although in some cases they certainly were. But it's interesting nonetheless to look at the Islamic factor and presence in Saint-Domingue because unlike Trinidad or Brazil or the U.S. South, we don't have really too many accounts of specific African Muslims in the colony. But we would assume they were there because similar Muslims have popped up, especially Manding Muslims in Jamaica and Trinidad, and Hausa Muslims as well. So they were definitely there. It's just, it seems we don't have enough sources at the moment to really speculate on more of the specifics of Muslims in Saint-Domingue. Our really best accounts come from a French naturalist who wrote about Fulani Islamized Muslims and Borno Muslims in the Artibonite region on the Rossignol des Dunes plantation. Other than that, I mean, we don't really have much knowledge of communities of Muslims, although again, it seems likely that many of the Hausa and Manding were Muslim, and perhaps several of the so-called Senegal were Muslim. But again, we can't really assume all the Wolof or Pulard were actually Islamic. Let's end here, and we'll return to this theme at a later date.